Hi, Bharat, can you hear me? Bharat, can you hear me? Susan, can you hear me? Hello, Susan.
Hi, sorry, just putting on my headset. I'm here.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you sound fine.
Good. I had some issues today. I'm with a Bluetooth headset now.
Ah,
So this guy, Bob, is not joining. Do you see that?
oh no, I didn't.
And I don't know what happened last week because I was kind of traveling then. So I got your minutes, but there was some discussion about some interfaces.
You know, I'm trying to think back now. Primarily, it was the presentation done for CNTT.
Okay.
And trying to remember if there were additional action items that came out of that. Do you typically keep the screen open on the, do you go to the portal?
I go there. I don't share it.
Okay.
If that's what you're asking.
I'm going to go there. I have a feeling most of the participants in this meeting are looking at that during this meeting. So we'll do.
Hi, Piotr. Hi, Muthu.
Hi, hello everyone.
Divya. Hey.
Hello everyone, this is Muthu from Amy.
Yeah.
Hi.
Right. Yeah, we have some items on the agenda. Somebody wants to continue the conversation about the API data model shared between the aggregated composer and other parts of ODIM. I think this is because we looked at the composition service, and we wanted to understand how it can be standalone and still use some functions from other services, like you know, for instance, the event service and these type of things. And that's kind of a challenge, I think. It is a challenge from an architecture because obviously when something wants to use the event service, I mean, it will typically be a plugin and they just stick the event on the message bus using a client connection to that message bus structure. If you program in Go, there are frameworks to do that. If you program in some other language, you have to set up a Kafka client. That's one thing. If you want to use a task from the task service, that is also something that is done when you get a request and you feel that it will take too long. You need to return a task and a task monitor URI. I don't know how that can be done from the outside. If we want to open up APIs for that, so that we can have one service coded in one language standalone and another Redfish service in another language standalone, then we are gonna be involved in defining those APIs. And to me, that is, it's not impossible. It's just a little bit of a challenge, right? But Bharat, you're on. Do you have any thoughts around that? Because, for instance, like the composition service might actually be doing some operations that requires it to generate a task. Any thoughts of how that could happen? How does it happen today, and how can it be done with an external service like the composition service?
Well, it's not even a composition service. I think we need to tease apart the client side from the actual Redfish composition implementation. If somebody's on the outside orchestrating or choreographing creation of a VMware cluster, for example, on demand,
yeah,
use the composition service to construct, say, 32 nodes that all look the same. And then they would want to group those nodes into an aggregate so that it can be managed consistently and configured consistently. And so somehow we need to have one view of the world.
But is this the same topic, Alex? Oh, sorry. I mean,
yeah, because but it applies across the board, right? There will
what applies? The ability to.
These services have to be able to invoke each other. And they have to somehow be able to share information as part of those invocations, right? Otherwise, you know, how is this going to work if everybody has their own worldview and everything is completely standalone?
Well, the services in the initial contribution are kind of in the same stack, and Bharat can talk about how you create a task in that environment. But then if we allow for standalone services, then we need to open up for some sort of an API. And if that is, we need to decide if that's going to be a REST-based API, if it's going to be some sort of a library type of thing, or how do we?
When you say standalone services, can you elaborate on what you mean by that? Because I kind of look at ODIM as a collection of integrated things, maybe against a Kafka bus or some other bus that you abstract away with the interfaces. So they're loosely coupled, but these components all have the same model in mind, which is the Redfish model. That's what they operate on. So regardless of how loosely coupled they are, my expectation would be that, you know, when an operation is performed, all of these services would reflect that operation in whatever the data model is that we have inside an ODIM instance.
Yeah, so Alex, previously, like, you know, we had worked with the RSD. So in that, what was happening is that the composition service was, you know, composition service is still not part of ODIM. So it was the RSD that was implementing has already that composition service, right? So whenever they used to say fire a search or whatever, when they get a task back, they would get that. And the Redfish API itself was used to communicate without any issues. So composer used to talk to ODIM using the composition, the set Redfish APIs and get back the task status and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And of course, they had their own inventory, like, you know, RSD has its own inventory, right? So the composition inventory, like the compose node inventory was maintained in the composer. The bare metal inventory was stored in ODIM. And about aggregates and stuff, now with the new aggregation spec, which is a part of 2020.2 onwards, we have support for aggregates and performing collections on them as a group. So
yeah, I understand all that, but what I'm suggesting is that the old way of doing it may not be the right way of doing it.
Okay.
We also need to distinguish between the composer, the application that invokes the interfaces, and ODIM that implements the interfaces. And I'm not talking about the composer. That could be a completely external entity.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, but that would use Redfish APIs, right?
Of course.
The problem we have here at hand is that if you have a standalone service that has no internal interaction with a task service and things, how will that thing create a task and these types of things?
Well, that's my point. We shouldn't have that, right? So that's what I mean, that if we have model-driven interfaces implemented by different modules within ODIM, then these implementations of all these different interfaces they have to ride on some common data model. I thought we kind of indicated that in our diagrams, that there is the redfish data model. Now that
Yeah,
is,
but there is
But-
no way
but-
of creating a task in Redfish.
well, then we talked about having a set of utility services that would provide basic functions, right?
What do you mean there's no way of creating a task in Redfish? Redfish is an API. Its duty is not to create anything.
Yeah, I mean, if I am a standalone service, there is no way, I cannot create a task.
Of course, I don't understand that statement. Your software, you can create anything you want. What do you mean you can't create a
No,
task?
John, I think what's being told is that, when say you send a request, of course, we send back a task from ODIM, but an external entity cannot ask for a task from ODIM, right?
No, an external
from a
entity
Redfish.
cannot create the task.
Of course
So
not.
there is no API that
Yeah.
use this to create a task.
Right, you create a job.
No, there is no job service in ODIM currently.
Oh, well, if there's a functionality you need, then that's what
So
you need to
that-
Yeah,
create.
but guys, coming back to the task itself, if when you let's say call the ODIM or any other entity which supports Redfish, and there's an async call, right? It will return the task created for fulfilling the request, and
Yeah.
the consumer can pull the tasks to to find out if it's completed or not.
Yep.
Yeah, but there is no direct call to create a task and monitor it. So as part of say, when
how does
you
that happen internally, Bharat? How does it happen internally? If let's
So-
say I am the update service, and you
Yes.
tell me to do something, and you get a task back, how do you create a task internally?
So what happens is when we get an update or even an aggregate service request, we create a task internally and immediately return back a accepted HTTP accepted 201 along with the task monitor URI. So and also additionally the user can subscribe for task-based events. So either they can pull back for the task monitor URI and get the status, or they can wait for the events like task completed and stuff like that. So as
Yeah.
part of the aggregation service, we send back a task.
So when you say we send back a task, is there an internal way in ODIM they create that task then?
Yeah, the task service is used internally, right?
Yeah. So the question here at hand is if we wanted to allow for something external to create a task, because Redfish does not specify how to do that, we will have to come up with our own APIs to do that in that case.
Yeah, and not just that, when say when say there is a third party like a composer service sitting on top of ODIM that creates that is doing something, it it should be managing the task lifecycle, right? So something that's delegated to ODIM does the task management. So
Okay.
it's just yeah.
Can we be very careful here? You talking about the composer or the composition service inside ODIM?
There is no composition
Yeah.
service inside ODIM.
Yeah, let's not mess it up, Alex. We need to be clear. There is a service. It can be inside of the ODIM or outside of ODIM, which will let's say take the request from the consumers to pull the hardware, pull the resources, and it will operate on the ODIM to fulfill the request. But yeah, I don't think what you're saying is like how we split between composer or composition service. I think this is the same function.
Guys, this is Muthu from AMI. The composition service we are currently planning, we are proposing is based on Intel RS department, as Bharat was pointing out earlier. The pod manager component has its own data collection and other things. It has its own backend task services and all. That is how we are proposing. So the current implementation of the pod manager API, the composition service API we are proposing is has its own task service in the background, and it takes care of everything. I'm just wanted to mention here.
I'm sorry, guys. I just need to understand something because maybe I'm just completely off base. And Raffle, please, bear with me.
Sure.
We've always looked at ODIM as a set of northbound interfaces based on the Redfish spec, based on the Redfish model, and implementing, Redfish services. So that's what ODIM is. It's an implementation of those services. ODIM southbound uses the resource management APIs defined by Redfish to talk to the BMCs, for example, or other entities that are control entities. So to me, whatever's inside ODIM has to be cohesive, right? It may not be cohesive today, but if we're going to make contributions to ODIM, then we need to sort of agree on what the desired architecture is.
So far, so good.
Right. And so for me, we shouldn't be putting in contributions that break that desired architecture. We should make contributions that comply with that architecture. And from my perspective, if you're gonna have, loosely coupled implementations of different interface definitions that are Redfish compliant, well, you can make them tightly coupled, loosely coupled, whichever way you want to, whatever. It's that's not the point. The point is that all of these implementations of the APIs work on the same Redfish model, right? Because the objects in the model are not standalone. They have associations between them, right? They have relationships. And so that's what I mean when I say that we have to operate against the common data model encoding.
But
Yeah,
it's not about operating against the same data model. It's about being able to use utilities that all the services use. All the services need to use the event message bus. All the services will need to be able to emit tasks.
Why don't
And
we
if
use the approach that John Leung suggested? If there's something needed in the spec, we put it in the spec. So if we believe,
he talked about the job service, and there is some discussion going in DMTF, right? I'm not
What discussion? I don't. There's no discussion. It's clear, right? Tasks are
dial in. You don't have discussion.
Tasks are created by the Redfish service autonomously. They're not created outside. Anything that's created anyone the Redfish client wants to create needs to be in the form of a job. And so I don't understand why you said, hey, I want to create a task from outside, and therefore I'm going to extend the Redfish model. It's never going to go into Redfish. Redfish will throw that out and say, stop.
I never said.
No, you didn't say it. Barack did. Right? He said we need additional commands to create the task.
No,
you're not going to get it.
I didn't say that, John.
We need to understand what a task is. A
task is self-generated by the Redfish service.
Yeah, but you cannot. Exactly, and it's if you think something is going to take too long, you give the client a task, right? And that is kind of happening.
You're not giving the client. Okay, the Redfish service provides the client a task object to monitor.
Are we okay with moving on? So if it takes too long, and then what happens, John?
It provides you a task to monitor, right?
So and if it takes too long, you get a task, yeah?
Right, unless in which case it will point you to a job, because the task is non-persistent.
So you get a task back if it takes too long. We haven't implemented a job service and in ODIM yet. And so how do you then, if you, for instance, are operating on APIs that involves the composition service and you do an operation that will take too long, you will get a task back. And currently we have this mechanism done in a very tightly coupled way in the current stack that exists, right? So if you now stand up a new Redfish service and that is not even coded in the same language, now we have a situation where you can't just use the internal way of generating this task that you need to give the client. And this is the problem at hand. And the solution is not, oh, for this, you should go and create a job instead. That is not the solution of that problem. That is the solution of other problems, right?
So Jonas, from my perspective, I think the composer as a service that implements the composition should be closely coupled. At least it should be under the gateway of ODIM. And the reason for that is because the ODIM is exposing, the data model of the underlying BMCs plus the resource aggregation service. Now, the composer as a consumer of this will offer the, let's say, creation of the computer system of compose type, which is good. But then if you want the resource aggregation service also offer aggregating the composed systems, then it should have to ability to contact the composer service, right?
Well, not the composer, but the composition service. Let's be very precise with that.
No, Alex. Composition service is a data model. We're talking about the software that is operating on this data model, right?
Well, the composition service is actually a service defined by Redfish, right?
It's a service defined by Redfish, but you need some software that implements the service, right?
But the software,
however you call it.
Oh my God.
But I look at the composer as a client of the composition service.
Okay, so we have different terminology. Okay.
But it doesn't really matter. I think your statement here, Rafał, and this is what I'm looking for, input here, is that if you want to stand up a Redfish service like the job service in the future, the composition service, it needs to be tightly coupled with the current stack. That's your viewpoint. I am in that camp as well, but Alex, a week or two
I am in
ago,
the same camp. I think we're all talking about the same thing. We just need to agree on the language because that's what's tripping us up. Can we talk about a composition service as an implementation of a Redfish API? And can we talk about the composer being a client that may use that interface in addition to others? Okay.
Yes. Composition service is like open source like component we are developing. Our composer product will make use of it.
Yeah, just like we have an aggregation service, we will have a composition service. Just like, and we may need to.
I will tune my terminology to yours, guys.
Yes. Okay. So now, I agree with Jonas that those services, they don't need to be monolithically implemented all in one blob, but whichever way they're implemented, they have to rely on the same data layer to be able to exchange information. Okay, so you can make the APIs model driven and you can make the implementations model driven, or you can have your own internal, east-west calls between services, right? There are two ways to do it. Either you have one common data model that you use as the source of truth for everything, or you make API calls and everybody has their own little snippets of the data model implemented. And then you end up with very chatty internal communications. Okay? So I agree that they all need to share the same view of the world. They all need to share the same data, right? It shouldn't have to be, my composer or whatever my client is should be able to call upon a succession of Redfish APIs in the order that I want in order to accomplish the task that I need. So the task at hand, as an example, as I described it, was I want to build a VMware cluster with 32 nodes and configure all the nodes. I will implement that by calling the composition service to build the nodes, and then the aggregation service to compose them into an aggregate. And then I will invoke a command across that aggregate to configure the boot order. That's what I want to be able to do as a client. Using programs, ad hoc API calls, using curl, whatever you want, right? That's the kind of interactions we should be able to support.
Sure, Alex, one of the possible implementation of what you're describing is you've got a gateway which routes your northbound call to the respective service. And the data model is, well, it should be coherent, but it's everyone is storing its own, cache database, whatever.
Well, you're going to get out of sync pretty quick. That's been proven time and time again. But yeah, you can kind of prune and refactor things and just kind of. You still need to have a federation, right? You still have to have a federated view of the model across all services, one way or another. So it's either it's federated, but everything is loosely coupled, or it's one model and you have, you know, different APIs routed to different implementations of that API that manipulate the model objects. There's
So
no magic, right? I mean, just look at all the other cases where this is the case, where this is true, right? You know, look at ONAP. There's a single inventory service acting as the data model, and all the other services talk to it in order to obtain the truth. They don't invent their own. They always talk to that service.
I'm just wondering, you know, about the performance consideration.
Well, if you can support simultaneous queries, why not? I mean, you make it into you create a little mesh that basically that allows you to scale out access to your model.
So if you look at the, I'm trying to share here, right? So the problem, and this is an old picture, but it doesn't really matter, right? The problem here is that these services, they all put up northbound APIs, and we have in ODIM today, we have kind of a like an API coordinator that exposes this and uses the different services under, right? So the question here is if one of these services needs something from the other, and today obviously then we have internal ways of dealing with that. And now we don't see the task service here, obviously, but if somebody needs to generate a task, it will be like a west-east type of communication there. And this all works just fine if everything is coded in the same language. But if AMI is contributing this in you know, Python, we're going to have a situation where we're going to have to ask, how do you, in such scenario, generate a task? Do you have your own task service then? And how does a northbound client handle that? This is the problem for me, right? That's what I don't understand.
I think the only way to handle that is the way I think we've kind of been saying is the set of utility services with maybe different kinds of interfaces. Maybe they're gRPC interfaces, I don't know, but something that you can invoke to create a coherent job namespace and a coherent task namespace. Well, forget about jobs for a second. But tasks, if you have a task manager that keeps track of everything, then that could be a standalone service that acts as a utility for everybody.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Alex, there are like for the east-west kind of communication, there are three options. Like, say, if you want to retain the Go micro, which is currently there, right, and say IMI comes with a Python implementation of the composition service, then we can have a sidecar implementation where a small Go program acts as a broker between the rest of ODIM and this Python
Well, and
module.
you can even do the same thing if you want to have a single data model manager, right? You
No,
can
no, just yeah. But there are other two options which I didn't mention. The one is that we can use you know, instead of Go Micro, we can use HTTPS interfaces, or something like which initially
Or
you
we
were
can call the
mentioning.
gateway, or composer or composition service can call the gateway on
Yeah.
top of ODIM array, right?
Yes,
I
that's what
think
was the current suggestion, right? That
Yeah.
compositions uses
Yes.
the gateway API service. But the only thing is, like, see, when we spoke about the task, I was trying to tell that, see, the task, I'm not talking about job, just the task part. Now, whoever wants to create a job within the ODIM framework, yes, there is a task service. They can get a task created, and they can keep updating that. But that's like, you know, but when you say you're adding a composition service above ODIM, then I would say that if you're whatever arguments you put forth, like you have 20 servers that need to be, you know, synchronized, and all the settings to be configured as an aggregate and all that can be done by the composition service. And since it is creating those tasks and working on that, it knows how to monitor the task, right? So if you
Yes.
have an interface, even if you possibly introduce an interface into ODIM, I mean, it will just every time it is trying to update a task status or whatever, or handling failures, it has to contact task service on the ODIM and then
Yeah.
do that, which
But
is
but
like,
is that the view then, Bharat, that the composition service is above ODIM? In that scenario, I think we're fine, because then obviously it's up to the composition service to either have its own task service or just relay the tasks that are created by ODIM, right?
How can
Yeah,
it be?
yes, Jonas. In the current, our proposed model of composition service sitting on top of the ODIM and communicates to the aggregation service to collect the data, because
How can
the
it be on top of ODIM if the composition APIs are defined as part of the Redfish and ODIM implements those interfaces?
Yeah, so I just want to give you some background. We had some discussions, me and Martin, with the DMTF guys on the HPE side about this back in the days, and that's why we elected to not implement the composition service, because the initial feedback we got was, oh, it's a separate thing. It will probably be on the north side of a centralized function on the north side of ODIM. And then I think that kind of changed. Martin, I don't remember if you, all of a sudden there was we should have it as part of ODIM. It needs to be out there on each little data center. So I think it's two different two different views of the world, right?
yeah.
yeah.
Well, yeah, but we need to kind of, yeah, okay. But given the current scheme of things, right? I mean, I think that old view of the world that composition is something entirely separate, that's not really how we see it now. I mean, there's a composition task force inside DMTF Redfish. It is a
Yeah.
service. It's not something standalone.
No, but it will still be a fish service. But please, John and Thomas, you guys are involved in this. What is your view here? Do you feel that the composition service will be something that is more centralized, or do you think it will be part of this stack? What are your thoughts?
I would think that you definitely would have an external intelligent piece that is belonging to each and every of the clients that selects which of the individual resources that, what were they called? Resource blocks that you're connecting with each other. But we're going towards, on the last meetings, towards that we're also having bundles of or already connected resource blocks with each other that can be connected more inside the Redfish or under the Redfish API, so to speak, so that the model in Redfish can handle that multiple resource blocks are already connected with each other and handled as objects that also can be connected together with each other. So that basically means that the ending state of where the composed resource blocks and how they sit and fit together, that will end up inside or under the Redfish API as a state in the active pool, as they say. And it's also a multi-client interface. So I think the thing about talking about where the intelligence sits is one thing. Another one is to talk about where does the state gets captured.
Well, where the implementation of the interface is, right? That's the division. We're using APIs as abstractions of the implementations. Right?
So, can I speak? So in the early days of composability task force, one of the issues was this is all dependent on how big the composition is and where it's contained, because from a Redfish standpoint, Redfish can compose those resources that it controls. The way ODIM is structured, if you are making a composition request at the highest level of ODIM, that thing can span multiple Redfish services, right, across edges and central offices. That's my understanding, which means that it was actually outside the realm of the composition call that we had. creation that we had. What the composition service within Redfish does is only manage those things within it. The current discussion within the composition task force is how do I link the perimeter of that composition to things that are outside the Redfish service, so I can talk to two Redfish services, have them compose things, and then have them linked together. Right, and that's the thing that ODIM needs to figure out and possibly tell the Redfish Forum is how do we now do that? How do we create this mega composition, right? And then send it out appropriately to those Redfish services that are part of that composition, and then stitch everything back together again. So the mega composition, whatever slice you have, right, is actually created, and all the Redfish services know what part they play in this larger composition.
So John, your supercomposition would sound like something that sits, a composer that sits on top of ODIM, right? Like multiple instances of ODIM.
Well, no, there's two, right? There's the initial composition, which is, sorry if I use the term wrong, I want a slice, right? And this crosses edges and central offices and whatever. And so this thing that is outside, right, will say, okay, fine, I've got 3 Redfish services I need to talk to put this thing together. So here are my individual requests to these 3 Redfish services, right? And then those Redfish services use their resources to create that portion of the larger composition, and then they stitch them together. So each individual Redfish service has its composition service, right, that you talk to, but there's a larger composition service on top, which understands multiple Redfish services.
And we put a slightly different context and say that there's a hierarchy of orchestration that happens.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but
the very
Redfish,
bottom layer of that, there is an ODIM implementation that has a composition service that acts on a set of resources.
Yeah.
So,
but is that fair though? Because I mean, then I was thinking the existing services in Redfish, if you exclude the composition service, do not know about these things, right? So then you will have a local one then that is a composition service that will know about these things, and then you will have a centralized one that will speak to the local composition service. That's what you're saying, Johannes.
Let me try this again.
Yeah,
so
sure.
say you have 3 locations: edge, core, and the enterprise, right? And you're trying to create something across all those 3 locations. So I could have an end-to-end view of the world somewhere, a client that knows how to orchestrate creation of dynamic composition of resources across those 3 locations. To do that, it would then fan out a request to compose things at each location. Okay. So you have maybe ODIM hierarchies. Maybe you have a standalone client. I don't know, but somehow you have to arrive at ODIM as the manager for some administrative domain of concern, and that domain may contain resources that are non-composed, that are atomic, or those that are composed. And each ODIM instance manages that. So you can think of each location as an administrative domain. And then, you have an instance of ODIM that manages stuff within those domains, or calls upon or delegates to other instances of ODIM to do whatever needs to be done, depending on how much hierarchy you've got.
No, so I think that's all fair arguments, right? But the question I'd have for John, and maybe Thomas as well, right, is in your understanding then for the extensions to the existing composition service, right, the ones that are discussed on the task force every week that, put together by John Haas, do you think that that composition service is intended to be hierarchical? It's built into the model as it is, or do you think that's something that would need to be added again?
It is
something I think. Go ahead, Tom.
Oh, I was going to let you. So I think the aspect of what's being added in the composition task force is exactly what Thomas has brought up: is how to define the periphery of the composition, which is within a Redfish service. because right now, when you make a composition request, the entity which is created is wholly owned by the reference service and is unconnected to the rest of the world, right? And it's like, oh, well, that's fine, but you don't live in an island, right? You live next to this other reference service, and it's got an edge boundary of some network, right? And so you need to tell your reference service, right, that when you create your composition with networking, right, here are your networking boundaries, right, and something above is going to connect your networking boundary to the networking boundary of reference service B, whatever was created by network.
When you say sorry, let me just. So that's something then, John.
Yes.
That you're saying that's something above. Do you think that's part of the spec that John is putting in, or do you think that's just something that's going to need to be pulled together by the vendors themselves?
I think it's part of his spec, because where I've done it with OVF, right, he's done it with his stanzas, and the stanzas that talk about networking are the ones that are going to have an entry to say, these are internal networking connections you need to make, and here is a networking boundary, right? And I'm going to name it this, and I'm going to tell it to my upper hierarchy so it can tell reference service B that I've named it that, right? So eventually it all gets connected, because at the periphery, right, all the naming needs to be correct, so all the blue wires get connected and all the red wires get connected. But that's all part of the quote standard structure, is why his is far more complex and more flexible than an OVF would have been.
Okay.
OVF had the same concept, right? But his is just a bit more elegant in that it's more expandable. So that part of his proposal I like, right? The rest of the stuff with is orthogonal.
So I'm trying to understand, where this lands us in general, right? Actually, guys, I'm trying to understand it, but I have to take a call. I'm sorry.
So I was going to ask Thomas, did he have a different view since he's in the same meeting?
No, I share most of the things you're saying, I think, as far as I understand it. But I think that one of the things in this debate that is hard to follow when you guys in ODIM talks about it is you're constantly moving back and forth in between what is aggregation of something on a wide distributed, multiple different sites, multiple different implementations, multiple different instances, and so on and so forth. That's hard to follow, at least for me. And what I feel that the Redfish service, that's fine. But if we want to define, we probably need to make a couple of pictures and put a couple of names.
Yeah, but I think the Redfish spec doesn't define aggregators of aggregators, and it's unfortunate because we have that today. For instance, ODIM, if ODIM was to manage something that is like an enclosure, now we have aggregators of aggregators.
I wanted to get back to what I see in the target for the Redfish composition service is, first of all, I view it personally, right or wrong, as being site local or local to the installation that you're managing with one Redfish instance. And maybe you can use the APIs on higher levels if you could do aggregations of aggregations, but I'm very, very skeptical that makes life simpler. I think it just complicates things too much personally, but that's a personal view. Yeah, what I see of the Redfish is that it strives to account for how do each and every resource block being used, by whom is it being used, and the interrelationship in between different resource blocks in terms of how do you reach them in the composition, being addressing wise and so on and so forth, and how are they topology wise connected, which also includes dependability in terms of that a resource block might be dependent on another resource block because they are a resource block for a VLAN is connecting a resource block for a server NIC with a resource block for another server NIC. And that then you have now created your composition of two servers interconnected with a network. And the accounting for that those belong to client two is in the redfish service as I see it. And that's to me a very, very good step forward, being site local. And at least me would like to keep it on that level, because frankly, I see a hard time trying to align the whole industry of all cloud providers in hybrid clouds, also providing resources on some sort of a level to have them speak redfish or have them speak ODIM. I mean, if we can pull off restricting certain parts to being what is site local, and we have a certain amount of API levels there, and then the levels above, to me, becomes what somebody said here, orchestration of those resources.
Or Thomas,
it makes it simpler to understand.
Or the levels below, right? Because I think there's the underlay and the overlay problem in what you
Absolutely,
described.
but the problem in these discussions is that we bring in too many variables and we never reach an endpoint.
Understood, but we need to also look at it from a consumption point of view, right? If we assume any kind of network service management model, it's always hierarchical.
Yeah,
it spans multiple locations.
Sure.
And so we need to fit into that pattern, right? Because ultimately, as I compose my end-to-end service, I will decompose the definition of that service down into smaller and smaller and smaller parts. And then eventually I will have to bind those small parts to actual physical resources that need to be connected together. So
Thomas, did you say that so you think that the composition service that is site local there with ODIM and understands the resources that are local there, that would be sitting in parallel with other redfish services? Is that your opinion as far as an architecture picture goes? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
I would say that's how I would envisage it.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that the other redfish services are completely separated. I mean, a redfish service for firmware upgrade is acting on the resource blocks, which is exactly the same resource blocks as being part of the composition.
Or aggregation, right? Or aggregation, Thomas. So.
Yes, Alex, and aggregation, but I'm not sure I fully understand that we have one unit view of what aggregation is. That's why I'm not bringing it up as an example.
Yeah, and let's not pollute the discussion.
Firmware upgrade to me is a very, very clear thing that you want to upgrade the firmware on a piece of hardware that in its lowest denominator is a resource block according to ODIM.
Yeah.
And you need to be able to do that on the resource block, which is one service. And you need to also be able to compose resource blocks together with each other in some sort of a hierarchy, which is the composition service. So they are two rather independent services acting upon the same atomic little resource block in the bottom. And they probably would have a relationship in between each other. So no, you're not allowed to do firmware upgrade if somebody is using the resource block kind of relationship.
Yeah, that's a good use case. Thank you. That put things in a good place for me. That is a good use case.
So in that use case, I'm just trying to understand how this would work. If I'm trying to do firmware upgrades, and I want to do firmware upgrades on 1,000 hosts at a time, what would be the flow, Thomas, in your mind of how that would be achieved?
The first thing I would do is to subdivide the actors in here.
Yes.
The actors would be somebody is physically owning the resource blocks.
Yes.
And they probably would be the one that would like to do firmware upgrade on the blocks. And they would only be allowed to do firmware upgrade of the blocks that they currently have in their position. So they would basically say, do firmware upgrade of all available resource blocks and the one that will be available over time. So I personally would create a job out of that one that is basically going on a schedule, maybe daily, and looking into, do I have any more resources that now have been put on the free list that I can act upon? Because all the busy ones I cannot act upon because they are used.
Yes.
Something like that would be my mental picture.
Okay, so somebody, some client, some management client creates a job that basically says, go upgrade firmware on all available resources. And that job could potentially be fanned out to other ODIM instances, right? You know, I guess let me kind of go back. A client would call upon ODIM to create a job to upgrade firmware on all available resource blocks. That would cause that same command to be dispersed and delegated to the instances of ODIM that actually have resources attached to them, because they may not have resource blocks attached to them, right? Resource blocks correspond to physical devices, but if you want to build hierarchies, those physical devices always end up on the bottom.
But the hierarchies would be the one that tells you if the resource blocks are used.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Right. And so you would delegate the actual action to do the upgrade to whichever instance of ODIM has resources attached to it. And that instance will determine what to do and what not to do based on the state of the resources under its control.
Yeah, and potentially when to be allowed to do it as well.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely. I agree. Yeah, but in general terms, the responsibility for managing resource blocks falls with the instances of ODIM that have resources, right? They have those blocks under management. Right?
So this
Yeah,
calls for
yeah.
more tightly coupled composition service with the rest, and I think that's very clear from the use case. I mean, if we just stick the composition service on top of ODIM, I could go to ODIM and say, hey, upgrade all these servers, and ODIM wouldn't have a clue that they're being used. They would just go ahead and
Yes.
Which then would make it totally unusable in a real world scenario. I mean, if you take the mental picture, what you're trying to implement is, for instance, the AWS resource keeping of all its physical resources. And then you have thousands and thousands of users of that physical data set.
Mm-hmm.
Then you get the complexity in here. And still, we're only at one physical site. And now you're trying to add that you're in a distributed world as well, and you're trying to do resource aggregation or redfish models. It's a huge complex task to do that kind of interconnections in between all the different do's and don'ts, because it's used and so on and so forth. Even just doing something simple as firmware.
But within, Thomas, within a given, you know, I'm thinking about Etsy ZSM, for example, right? So, which is also related to SA5 in terms of how the management model works. And what we have there is this notion of hierarchical management domains. And some domains own resources or have resources under management, which corresponds to resource blocks in our world. Others don't. They're just intermediaries that know how to fan things out. And so they're more responsible for delegation or escalation, for points of mediation of telemetry, things of that nature. But ultimately, you could orchestrate from the very top, from the end-to-end service perspective. You could say, I want to upgrade firmware on all resources, compute resources for this service instance. And that could percolate down through a set of API calls all the way down to the bottom level where you actually have physical resources under management. And you can do that across multiple locations or across, you know, within a single location, right? It doesn't really matter.
I do agree with you, but the world is definitely not going towards more and more single operator type of use cases. It's more going towards that the services all use hybrid multi-clouds, which means that you need to federate in between the service orchestration and the cloud infrastructure orchestration instances.
Yeah, you do that through service catalogs if you really want it to work well, because then you have a nice boundaries, and you can have individual, you know, data models or domains or domain models within each individual, you know, boundary. You don't have to have one big, huge well, you still need one big, huge federated one, but it could be a dynamic federation. It could be a dynamic query spanning multiple inventories or multiple, you know, systems of record. You still will need to do that at the very top.
So I think We only have 7 minutes left. I wanted to get to some of the other bullets as well, if possible. I think this discussion, at least now, we have an understanding of a couple of good use cases, and we understand that we need tighter couplings here. So we need to have started a discussion on how to make that happen. And that is something we can continue to do in TSC. We can fire up another working group or something and try to schedule around it so we get that taken care of fairly quickly, because I don't want that to be a roadblock for any contribution. But having stated that, is it okay if we move on to the next topic?
Sure.
Alrighty. So we have next topic was where are we in the composition service? I think we killed that horse, right? That's done. Martin sent out the white paper with a proposal on 25th September. For me, it went into my junk folder and I never saw it. If you guys also have the same problem, and that is why we have no comments, which I suspect it is, could you dig through your junk folder and see if it's in there? It's from Martin Hoff. Yeah.
I just found mine today in that same junk folder that you found yours in. I have no idea why it sent it that way, but that's where it ended up too.
All right, so let's give it a week and you guys can have a look and then we can start talking about changes. And another bullet was a name for the repository for the BMC simulator. So that's a separate one. I don't really have any preferences there. Is that something we could just tee up, or do you have any proposals on the Intel side? Was that who put that there? That might have been Bob, and he's not here. Rafal, do you have any proposals? Is Rafal still around? Yeah, he is. Can anybody hear me? Hello.
Yes,
Yep,
yes.
Oh, okay, good. All right. Okay, if I think we should have some proposals and then we can just decide on a name. As long as it's not offensive, I have no issues, right? And then we have the last bullet. ODIM's official.
Jonas, I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can now. Rafael, go ahead.
So I just wanted the official name for the BMC simulator repository. I believe it will be in parallel to the ODIM. Just to be sure that we need this name for just some internal process. So I would propose BMC simulator, just like that.
I have no issues with that. Do we want to? I think we only have 4 minutes, so I don't know that we can. Do we have time to take a vote? How do we do it? We just say who all agrees about BMC simulator. Is that a yes or no? I guess we can vote about. How do I do that? In the chat window.
Well, you can just ask if there are any objections to calling
Are
it
there any
BMC
objections? Thanks, John. Are there any objections on BMC simulator? Nope. Okay, great. It's a done deal. We will let the minute reflect that.
Okay.
The copyright header question that is in there, let me read it out because I still have 4 minutes. What will be the ODIM official copyright header? Current contribution from HPE contains company name. Shall we follow that pattern? What if company X modifies source code file created by company Y? I think what I've seen in the past, first out, I think we should ask LF for guidance here. What I've seen in the past is that some people might join without having to sign their company name as a copyright thing. They might create work under their own name. So then in those scenarios, the copyright will be their own names. If you are editing a file that a company X has already edited, you would just do a second line of with copyright. And then, in the end, there might be 10 copyright statements in the same file. And that should cover it, right? I think, though, even though I've seen that in the past, we should still reach out to LF and ask them. Do we have any representative from LF here today, by the way? It doesn't look that way. If anybody else has some experience in this area and you want to chime in, please go ahead. Okay, then I will just take an action to send an email to Luis and ask him if they have any guidance. And if you're fine with that, I can basically give you some feedback next week, or I ask it on the TSC mailing list and we can all see it there. Good?
Yes.
Okay. So then I don't have anything else. Anything else from anybody today? Okay. Have a great rest of the day, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good
Thank
one.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye.